This move initiates the English opening, a flexible flank opening that aims to control central squares indirectly and often leads to complex strategic battles with a wide range of possible pawn structures and development schemes. This move immediately signals intentions towards hypermodern defenses like the King's Indian or Grunfeld, where black delays central pawn control, aiming to counterattack later. This move develops a knight to a natural central square, preparing to control d5 and potentially support a pawn advance to e4, while keeping flexible options open in the English opening. This move signals black's intention to enter the King's Indian defense, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g7 for long-term kingside pressure. This move boldly stakes a claim in the center, challenging black's King's Indian setup and aiming for a classical pawn structure that grants white space and attacking chances. This move solidifies black's pawn structure, preparing to fianchetto the king's bishop and entering a flexible King's Indian setup, while also challenging white's central pawn. This move firmly establishes a strong pawn center, characteristic of the classical King's Indian defense, aiming to control key squares and prepare for future piece development. This move signals a commitment to the King's Indian defense setup, with black developing the bishop to its natural diagonal to pressure white's central pawn and prepare for kingside castling. This move solidifies the center and prepares for a kingside pawn storm, though it does weaken the dark squares around the king slightly. This move, castling kingside, is a logical development step that secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, common in the King's Indian defense setup against white's fianchetto and central pawn advance. This move develops a piece to a useful square, reinforcing the e4 pawn and preparing for kingside castling while simultaneously supporting a potential d5 pawn push to control the center. This move challenges white's central pawn formation, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially transpose into variations of the King's Indian defense or Grunfeld defense structures. This move strategically solidifies white's central pawn control and prepares to restrict black's king's side development, typical of structures arising from the King's Indian defense. This move begins a thematic maneuver within the King's Indian defense, aiming to redeploy the knight to a more active square and potentially challenge white's central pawn structure. This move develops the queen to support a kingside pawn push or to prepare for a queenside castling, while also connecting the rooks. This move, qh4+, initiates an aggressive kingside attack by unbalancing the pawn structure and opening lines towards white's king, aiming to exploit the early development of white's queen. This move develops the bishop to a more active square where it defends the king and prepares for potential queenside castling, while also anticipating black's aggressive pawn push on the kingside. This move aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities by forcing a response to the queen's awkward position. This move re-establishes the bishop on a more active square, preparing to defend the kingside and potentially support a kingside pawn push while also preparing for potential castling. Black continues to harass the white queen, aiming to disrupt white's development and potentially exploit the king's exposure. This move aims to control the important f4 square and prepare for kingside pawn advances to challenge the black knight, while also allowing the g-pawn to support the central pawn structure. This move is a speculative pawn sacrifice designed to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, aiming to exploit the compromised kingside. This move activates the queen, protecting the knight on h4 and preparing to recapture the pawn on g3 if black's knight moves. This move sacrifices the knight to expose the white king and disrupt white's pawn structure, aiming to gain initiative and open lines for attack. This move, qxh4, captures the knight that black aggressively maneuvered into white's territory, removing a tactical threat and simplifying the position while regaining material lost earlier. This move strategically sacrifices the knight to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, aiming for active counterplay in the subsequent middle game. This move is a necessary repositioning to safeguard the king from further checks after a chaotic exchange, aiming to connect the remaining rooks and prepare for development in the center. This move by black is an attempt to regain material equality and disrupt white's pawn structure. After capturing the f1 rook, though it leaves black's king slightly exposed, this move develops the rook to an active central file, pressuring black's pawn and preparing to contest open lines in the upcoming middle game. Black's knight reroutes to the queenside, aiming to occupy the c5 square and potentially contest the open c-file, while also escaping white's pressure on the d4 pawn. This knight maneuver aims to centralize the piece, potentially supporting a kingside pawn push or redeploying to a more active square like f2 or e3, while also freeing the c-pawn to advance. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares like d5 and potentially prepare for further pawn breaks or piece development. This move intends to centralize the knight, reinforce the e4 pawn, and prepare for kingside pawn expansion to gain space. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal is a natural part of the fianchetto setup and prepares to contest the important d5 square. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest control of key squares like d5 and f5, while also supporting potential pawn advances. This move reinforces the kingside pawn structure, preparing to develop the kingside pieces and potentially challenge white's knight on e3 or control the e5 square. This move initiates a central pawn push with the intention of challenging black's control of the d-file and creating attacking chances on the kingside. The move (19) Rad8 prepares to activate the rook on the semi-open d-file, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially support a future pawn break. This move prepares to expand on the queenside and potentially challenge black's light squared bishop's influence. This move initiates a central pawn break aimed at creating dynamic play and challenging white's space advantage, potentially opening the c-file and activating black's pieces. This capture opens the d-file, creating immediate tension and forcing black to react to the threat of white's doubled pawns. A crucial moment in developing central control. Capturing with the b-pawn opens the b-file for potential future rook activity and aims to contest white's central pawn majority by disrupting their structure. This move is a tactical blunder that sacrifices the knight for material that isn't immediately exploitable and exposes your king to further attack. This capture opens the g-file for white's rook, creating immediate attacking chances against black's weakened kingside. This move forcibly opens the g-file with check, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and disrupt black's defensive setup after the previous tactical exchanges. The king's recapture is forced after white's exchange sacrifice, leading to a materially unbalanced position where black has a queen for two rooks, but white's king is dangerously exposed. This rook maneuver exploits the open g-file, targeting the vulnerable black king and forcing decisive material gain or a swift end to the game. The king retreats to a more defensible square, preparing to regroup and defend the remaining pawns against white's aggressive rook. This move forces black's king into a more exposed position on the g-file, aiming to open lines for the white queen and potentially create mating threats. The king is escaping into the center, but white now has a dangerous open g-file and strong central control, threatening to overwhelm black's exposed monarch. This move capitalizes on the exposed black king, forcing it to move again and continuing the attack initiated by the queen sacrifice, aiming to simplify into a winning endgame. The king is forced to retreat further into the center of the board, creating a dangerous target for white's remaining pieces. The move repeats a checking sequence to force further material concessions, leveraging the exposed king's vulnerability. This move continues the king's perilous journey through the center, seeking refuge while white's queen and rook maintain strong attacking pressure on the weakened kingside. The white queen continues to press for an advantage by forcing the black king into a passive square, aiming to exploit the open g-file in the exposed king position. The current position is a sharp tactical mess stemming from an unusual opening sequence. Black's king is exposed and must navigate to safety while white aims to exploit the open lines and attacking chances around the black king. This move is a brilliant tactical shot exploiting white's discovered attack on black's king and the vulnerable e6 pawn, aiming to regain material lost earlier and create mating threats. This move is a critical tactical decision to escape the discovered attack and centralize the king, but it leads into a dangerous mating net with the knight on g5 and the opponent's queen poised to exploit weaknesses. This move repositions the knight to a strong central square, attacking the weak pawn on c6 and preparing to support a potential kingside attack or defend the king. This move seeks to defend the weakened kingside squares and prepare to bring the rook to a more active central file after the king retreats, aiming to counter white's initiative on the kingside. This aggressive rook maneuver aims to exploit the open g-file, threatening to penetrate black's weakened kingside and create mating threats against the exposed black king. This move activates the rook to the c-file, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially support a pawn advance or reinforce the kingside defense. This rook sacrifice is a decisive blow, clearing the g-file to unleash the white queen for a devastating mating attack. With the white rook sacrificing itself, black is forced to recapture, bringing their king into a precarious central position and opening up lines for white's remaining pieces. This knight check forces the black king to an even more exposed position, paving the way for white's decisive mating attack or material gain. This move aims to regroup the king towards the center, preparing for potential pawn pushes and aiming to avoid immediate checks or further material loss, while setting up a more active defensive posture. This move is a decisive sacrifice that opens the king and creates unstoppable mating threats, forcing black to abandon defense. The king is now forced to retreat to the center of the board where it is still vulnerable, highlighting the importance of king safety and the consequences of a poorly defended monarch. This move forces the black king into an even more exposed position, continuing the mating attack initiated by white's active queen and rook. The king's desperate flight towards the queenside is a logical continuation, seeking safety in the corner, though the exposed position remains a significant concern. This move recaptures a pawn and maintains a strong central presence, while the white king is still somewhat exposed. This move brings the rook to an active central file, challenging white's passed pawn and preparing to contest the open e-file for counterplay. This move aims to create a protected passed pawn on h5, which will be a significant strategic asset in the endgame. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the central dark squares and potentially support a future pawn advance or attack. This pawn advance aims to create space and potential mating threats on the kingside while also preparing to potentially support a central pawn push or provide an escape square for the king if needed. This move repositions the knight to a more central square, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing to contest control of the d7-h3 diagonal, which could become important in the endgame. This move continues white's attempt to exploit the exposed black king by creating a passed pawn and opening lines, while also preparing to support the pawn's advance. The move ***39. Nf8*** is a defensive maneuver aiming to bring the knight back into play from a passive square, intending to support the g7 pawn and potentially contest the open f file or centralize. This move expands white's queenside majority, preparing to create a passed pawn on the queenside and gain space. The move aims to reactivate the knight by heading towards the kingside, potentially to support a pawn push or contest the open file with its advanced counterpart. This move centralizes the king, preparing to re-enter the game actively and support the queenside pawns while simultaneously eyeing the dangerous passed pawn on h6. The knight repositions to e7, aiming to defend the central pawn and potentially join the counterplay on the kingside, while the white king advances, seeking a safer square or to participate in the endgame. This pawn push is a critical race to promote, as the king is too far back to effectively stop the pawn's advance to the 8th rank. This move captures the pawn on h7, centralizing the knight and aiming to create threats against white's king while also opening a pathway for the rook on f8. This knight sacrifice is an attempt to force a promotion with the h-pawn, but black has multiple defensive resources to stop it. This move is a desperate attempt to reroute the knight to a more active square, but it's too late to recover the lost material and positional advantage. This move, nf8, repositions the knight from an active central square to a defensive role on the back rank, anticipating the potential pawn push on the kingside and offering support for the king's eventual escape route to the g7 square. The knight's return to the c8 square is a strategic repositioning, aiming to support the g7 pawn and prepare for potential activation of the rook on the c-file or even a queenside advance. This pawn move prepares to create a passed pawn on the queenside by potentially advancing the b-pawn, aiming to restrict black's rook activity and gain space. This move activates the bishop to the more dynamic e8-a4 diagonal, aiming to support the pawn push on the kingside and potentially join the attack against white's king if the opportunity arises. The knight on f8 is attacked and forced to move, leading to the pawn on h7 becoming a passed pawn and a significant threat. The knight on e6 has just delivered a crucial check, forcing the king to move and bringing the knight closer to the central squares while white's rook aggressively attacks from the g-file. Black must react to this immediate threat to the king's safety. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to support the pawn push on h7 and potentially control key central squares, aiming to exploit white's slightly loose king position. The knight's retreat to c7 is a cautious maneuver, repositioning to defend the crucial d6 pawn and prepare for potential counterplay along the 7th rank while avoiding immediate threats. The knight repositions to f5, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king and potentially create threats on g7 or e7. The move aims to reactivate the rook on the 7th rank and create potential threats along the 7th rank, while also supporting the knight's advance. This move prepares to advance the queenside pawns, aiming to create a passed pawn with the a-pawn and open lines for the remaining rook. This move attempts to reposition the bishop to a more active square, potentially supporting a future advance of the a-pawn or creating defensive threats against white's approaching king. The king activates to a more central and active position, aiming to support the eventual advance of the queenside pawns and potentially participate in endgame operations. This move aims to activate the bishop and potentially create threats on the kingside or support a queenside advance by the knight. This move extends the passed pawn, aiming to create new attacking chances and potentially force a queen trade to simplify into a winning endgame. This move seeks to activate the rook on the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially target weak pawns. This move is a proactive attempt to exploit the exposed nature of black's king, aiming to force a quick checkmate or win material by activating the queen on the h6c1 diagonal. The move 52, Road 7, aims to regroup the rook to a more active central file, preparing for potential counterplay and defending the pawn on d8. This move aggressively opens lines and challenges black's defensive structure, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and create attacking opportunities. This capture on f4 opens the g-file, creating new attacking possibilities for white's rook and potentially liberating the g7 pawn for future advancement. This move recaptures the pawn and maintains a strong attacking advantage, simplifying to a favorable endgame by removing a key defender and further disrupting black's pawn structure. The move 54, Rf7, redirects the rook to a more active square, aiming to support the king and potentially contest the open f-file if white advances their pawn further. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, intending to support the advance of the f-pawn and potentially create mating threats against the black king. Black reinforces the queenside pawn majority with this move, aiming to create counterplay while white consolidates their king's safety. White is aiming to regain the initiative by repositioning the queen to a more active square where it can support advances or threaten the opponent's king. The bishop repositions to e6, defending the rook on d7 and reinforcing the pawn structure while aiming to exploit the open central files. The move qh6 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square where it can exert pressure on black's kingside and potentially support a pawn advance or a rook lift. This move exchanges black's active bishop for white's rook, simplifying the position and aiming to leverage the open d-file for potential counterplay, though it does concede the bishop pair. This pawn recapture opens the e-file and creates a passed pawn, aiming to exploit the exposed nature of black's king and potentially gain material or force decisive pawn breakthroughs. The move 58, d5, aims to open lines and create counterplay for black by challenging white's central pawn majority and potentially activating black's remaining pieces. The move kd4 aims to centralize the king, bringing it into a more active defensive and offensive role, potentially supporting further pawn advances or participating in kingside play while eyeing potential weaknesses on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more central square, aiming to support potential pawn advances and control key squares while also preparing to defend against white's active pieces. This move aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, preparing to support the pawn push and potentially create threats against black's king. Moving the king to b7 aims to centralize and activate the monarch, preparing to support potential pawn advances on the queenside and seek active play in the endgame, although it leaves the king somewhat exposed. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to control the central files and support potential pawn advances while maintaining pressure on black's position. This move repositions the knight from a seemingly active but somewhat exposed square to a more stable central post, preparing to support the d-pawn and potentially infiltrate on the kingside or center. The queen repositions to a more active square, potentially preparing to support a pawn push or exert pressure on the kingside. The black king now retreats to c7, seeking refuge and preparing to potentially join the defense on the queenside while also keeping an eye on the central pawns. The move Ca8 aims to attack the pawn on c6, which white has already weakened by exchanging pieces and opening lines, potentially leading to further material gains or positional advantages. The move seeks to centralize the king and prepare for potential pawn advancements on the kingside, while also contesting the d-file and guarding against white's a-pawn push. This check forces the black king onto a more exposed square, setting up a discovered attack by the rook on the a-file and solidifying white's material advantage. This move continues the king's journey to a more active square, aiming to support the advanced pawn and potentially find refuge from the perpetual check by consolidating. White repositions the queen to a more active square on circa 5, eyeing the vulnerable knight on d6 and preparing potential advances or threats on the queenside. The knight repositions to d6, centralizing the piece and defending against potential pawn advances by white, while also preparing to support the king's eventual escape if necessary. This move initiates a decisive pawn capture, aiming to exploit black's exposed king and create unstoppable passed pawns on the queenside to secure the endgame victory. Black's recapture on c8 is forced by white's threat of mate on a7, but it allows white to win the bishop on a2, significantly simplifying the game in white's favor. This check forces black's king to the edge of the board, aiming to exploit the open a-file and coordinate the queen and rook for a decisive mating attack.